Another of the magician's greatest foes were the Rakavs, hideous trickster creatures who enjoyed causing discontent and chaos wherever they traveled. They had the power to take control of other spells and turn them against their owners and twist the natural order of certain worlds in various ways. These blue skinned, grinning, hideous creatures were, according to legend, refugees from a hell universe that they had ruled over for centuries. Apparently, they enjoyed the act of actually conquering their universe more than ruling it. After breaking down their fellow demons, they saw no fun in torturing them anymore and yearned to have creatures who would fight back and try and challenge them, so they destroyed their own reality and headed for others to torment. For this reason, when retreating to the magical realm, the Rokovs didn't conquer any universe, at least, not in a way where the great powers would be aware. They simply influenced many realities from behind the scenes and gained control of many planets, empires, and even galaxies, to the point where they could inflict incredible devastation in all manner of ways. Which, despite their methodical and complex strategies, was still all the demons wanted. Simple chaos for their own amusement. Sometimes, the monsters enjoyed letting their victims know that they were responsible, though only if there was no possible escape for their victims. Most of the time, however, they operated in secret so as to allow the natives to have false hope, and in the demons' twisted eyes, be more fun to break. They wreaked havoc on multiple universes within the magical realm before visiting the magicians. Many, however, have called this story into question, arguing that nothing about the Rokovs could be trusted given their nature. Still, whatever the real truth, they did possess tremendous power, beyond even that of most of the magician's other enemies. Even the people of the Green Mist were afraid of them to some extent. In fact, only the Raseliacs, in their arrogance, at least, never claimed to be afraid of the Rokov. The magician first encountered them when one Rokov was tormenting a particular planet with a twisted spell that granted human-level intelligence to all life forms on the planet and trapped them there, forcing all the life forms to fight and compete with each other. The magician was able to break the Rokov's force field and drain its own intelligence by reversing the spell, after which he would help the numerous, now intelligent creatures find other uninhabited worlds they could travel to. Sadly, however, one of the Rokov's servants, or pets, escaped in the middle of the conflict and warned the others about the magician, which would lead to the monsters specifically hunting him down. The magician was forced to go on the run for many years as a result, and could never just stay in one place for too long. He was eventually forced into an awkward alliance with the people of the Green Mist, who had long wanted to strike back at their only rivals. Together, both were ultimately able to strike at the heart of the Rokov's power base and finally cripple it, scattering the monsters across the entire realm. Still, the Rokov were not completely destroyed and would continue to strike at the magician for years afterwards. Another of the magician's worst enemies were the Carcassa, hideous lobster-like creatures that originated from a small ocean planet named Cassian. These monsters were actually amorphous blobs who constructed robotic, upright, lobster-like, humanoid bodies to house themselves in, which were made of a special metal that could repel all forms of magic, known as Clasbian. This metal could be found in both the natural and the magical realm, though it was more abundant in our reality. The Carcassa, meanwhile, ironically only learned of the existence of Clasbian because they were such weak creatures who had been almost driven to extinction by both the fierce predators of their world and the constant invasions from other planets. The Carcassa were forced to flee to the very bottom of their oceans, and whilst desperately trying to harness any of the scant resources they could from beneath the ocean floor, they stumbled upon the Clasbian, which they later fused to construct their war machines and armor. They subsequently not only conquered their own world, but many others too. The Carcassa's weak, amorphous bodies meant that they could not harness the more powerful magics of the realm, and so their power lay almost entirely in their robotic armor. Unfortunately, that was more than enough. The majority of these creatures within the magical realm were weak without their spells and enchantments, and the Carcassa's towering robot bodies and warcrafts were easily able to cut through any defenses even the mightiest magical empires possessed. The magician himself was utterly helpless against these monsters when he first faced them, with his boat being nothing more than an actual harmless old wooden boat against these creatures. Both the magician and the other powers of the universe were forced to harness the few natural elements of this magical universe in order to fight back against these monsters. The Horvania, in contrast, were a product of the darkest magics from this universe brought to life. Curses and enchantments don't always last forever. When and if their subject dies, they naturally dissipate, and there are magics and spells that can reverse them, depending on the curse. However, those that do dissipate don't always fade into nothing. Sometimes, small traces of them remain and confuse with other stray spells, and in some cases, even spirits, to eventually form into a new entity. Thankfully, in our reality, this process is extremely rare. But in the magical realm, there are many life forms that are created from stray or old curses themselves. The Horvania were the worst, however. They were not only made from the remains of the darkest curses that were created to consume worlds, they also had the power to consume other curses and forms of dark magic, either using their power for themselves or to create new life forms with them. At first, the Horvania were viewed as heroes by the rest of the galaxy. They would travel to planets overrun by black curses and magic and consume them. They even helped the magician save one of his favorite planets that had been cursed by its former ruler. However, the magician soon learned the truth, that the Horvania had actually cursed the planet themselves when he discovered the former tyrant who convinced them that he would never condemn his own world that he wanted to rule. The Horvania often cursed planets, as that way the curse could spread and grow, allowing them to gain greater power when they ate it. The Horvania were exposed by the magician, leading to their feud, which would last for centuries. The Horvania's leader, named Dakra, in particular became another one of the magician's archenemies. He would later find a way to possess the magician, and through him, reverse some of the spells the magician had used to heal worlds and individuals, turning them into curses and monsters. In this respect, the Horvania inflicted the greatest ever loss on the magician, though thankfully, the magician was still able to break free before the Horvania was able to reverse even a small fraction of his great work. Still, thanks to Dakra, the magician ended up being responsible for the deaths of millions. Following this, the magician traveled alone for many years and was utterly ruthless in dispatching the Horvania in order to track down his most hated enemy. He eventually got his revenge by finding a way to take control of Dakra, after which he cast him as a curse within the darkest planet in the magical omniverse, one that had been overrun by demons, who would subsequently condemn Dakra to an eternity of suffering. Following his defeat of Dakra, the magician came to regret what he had done, believing that his desire for revenge had turned him into a monster who was willing to condemn his enemies to eternal suffering. While there was no way he could help Dakra, he at least hoped he could achieve some redemption for his sins, and began traveling with others again. Sadly, for the magician, his feud with Dakra was not over, as whilst the Horvania could not escape from the hell world he had been banished to, he did still possess a link with the magician due to the time he possessed him, and was slowly, over the years, able to use this to not only haunt his dreams and make the magician relive the horrors he had carried out while under Dakra's control. He was eventually able to drag the magician's soul into the hell world, to make him suffer as well. Fortunately, the magician's then companion, named Elysian, was able to rescue him and help the magician permanently sever the link with Dakra. Though the magician offered to let Dakra come with him before he escaped, the living curse refused, believing that he could take control of this planet like he had done many other powerful curses, and that when that happened, the magician would see him again. Fortunately, it appears, he was unsuccessful with his own arrogance, condemning him to an eternity of suffering. Not all of the magician's enemies originated within the magical realm. Some were visitors, just like he was. Arguably, his greatest individual enemy after Dakra and Axvor was the evil and insane witch named Valenka. She came from far in Earth's future, from our perspective. At some point, after the age of Taros, when humanity had taken to the stars again, and long after the destruction of Earth, but long before the universe began to evolve into the next stage, and humanity had to flee to this new universe. She had, reportedly, ruled over a colony originally run by criminals that was kept on the outer reaches of the human empire at that point. Reportedly, she was exiled there for carrying out small, petty crimes, but unfortunately for the empire, whilst on the planet she was able to harness the last few traces of magic. The prison planet in question had been chosen as it was seemingly a dead world, devoid of almost all life resources, and magic too. However, little did they know, Valenka came from a long and powerful family of witches. She had been cast out of them for using her magic for vindictive, personal reasons. Apparently, when she was just 15 years old, she cursed her father by making him go insane and murder his new wife and family. The magic came from her mother's side. Valenka didn't even care that much about her father. She was so selfish, narcissistic, and cruel, she found it difficult to care about anything but herself. She was more insulted by the idea that her father was happier with his new family than hers. Even Valenka's mother was disgusted. And Valenka was not only thrown out and cut off from the rest of the family, but erased from their records. Such was their shame at her despicable crime. She spent the next few years living on the streets and turned to petty crime to make a living. Her skills with magic were not innate at that point, and she feared that if she utilized the few limited spells she knew, her family would strike her down. After being exiled, however, she utilized the few skills she had left without fear, and eventually harnessed the magic of this world to take control of the wardens on the planet, who then brought magic from all over the galaxy to her, which over the years allowed Valenka to build her power up in secret, until she was strong enough to strike back at the human empire. Among her first victims were her family, all of whom she condemned to an eternity of torment, using the darkest spells she had gathered from across the universe. The war she caused would endure for centuries, leading to the destruction of countless worlds, and others being condemned to the most horrific curses for eternity. Eventually, Valenka, who became one of the most powerful witches in the history of our universe, more of a dark goddess than a witch, fled to the magical realm, where she would continue to build more empires that inevitably fell, thanks to her own cruelty and corruption. Meanwhile, the final magic war that Valenka caused is what ultimately led to humanity shunning magic for centuries, until the magician ironically arrived. Valenka was intrigued at the idea of another wizard from her own reality entering the magical realm, and at first fought with the magician out of curiosity, and because she thought it might be an amusing game. While she tried to act like a lofty god who was simply trying to amuse herself, Valenka was a bad loser, who in one instance even destroyed an entire world, then let the magician win a game. As time went on, however, and as power grew, she became genuinely scared that he might one day rival her, and would make it her mission to destroy him. The more the magician escaped, however, the more she grew to genuinely despise him. She eventually targeted Xankia and condemned it to a curse, whilst she tried to draw the magics from it. However, the magician was able to defeat her by ensuring that she drained too much, which caused her own body to explode. Ironically, in her attempts to strike against the magician via Xankia, she ended up helping him win favor with at least some of its leaders again. Still, she would inflict one of the most devastating losses against the magician when she trapped Elysian in a magical bubble where she was forced to live out her worst fears over and over again. Sadly, not even the magician could break this curse. Valenka had used the last of her magic from our universe to condemn Elysian, which was more powerful than any on Xankia, that along with the magician's magic had become diluted through exposure to this universe over the years. She had no problem with using it up, despite the advantage it gave her, as by this stage Valenka was so consumed with hatred for the magician, she would have gladly sacrificed her own life. The magician would spend many years hunting Valenka, as well as trying to find a way to free Elysian from her torment. Eventually, the crazed witch returned to our universe in the hopes of replenishing the primal magic from our reality, which led the magician following her in his vessel. She was able to catapult herself across the Black Ocean in a matter of days by draining the magic of several worlds in this universe to propel her. Sadly, once again the magician failed to save these planets, but used the last of their power to follow her. The two enemies had their final battle in the new universe, with both struggling to control and navigate its new and hostile magic, which had evolved along with the rest of creation. In the end, however, the magician was able to seemingly destroy her soul once and for all, before returning to the magical realm. He was also able to take a large sample of the new, evolved magic, and finally break the curse Elysian was trapped in. Sadly, however, the curse had broken Elysian mentally, and mutated her physically, as well to the point where she was now a monster who sought to inflict the pain she had endured on others, especially the magician, who she blamed. The magician had been forced to take the long way home to the magical realm, traveling across the Black Ocean once again by himself, forcing Elysian to endure decades of torture. In this form, Elysian would go on to become one of the magician's worst enemies, and would be responsible for the death of the one woman he loved since Lindsay, though we shall explore that tragedy later. Among the other visitors to the magical realm that would plague the magician included the vampiric creatures known as the Ascaria. These creatures, according to the legends, were descended from a powerful vampire that dabbled in magics. This bloodsucker had found the ability to drain magic from its victim's blood and absorb any wizard or witch it fed on's powers. After killing an incalculable number of witches and warlocks and wizards, the vampire reportedly vanished to the magical realm in the hopes of gaining greater power. Furthermore, his body had been twisted by magic to such an extent that those he turned inherited the same ability to absorb magic too. At first, he tried to create an army of similar vampires, but eventually, at least, some of his minions turned their back on their creator and spread out across the magic realm, becoming among its top predators. The Ascaria were much more powerful than the vampires of our reality, and considerably harder to kill, as each individual possessed different powers and weaknesses from one another due to magic altering their bodies. Naturally, the magician became a target for these monsters due to possessing magic from our reality. The magician already didn't exactly have the best history with vampires, thanks to his dealings with Professor Fang and what happened to his mother. But these monsters would truly push him to its limits. Finally, the Kalkanta would also return after many centuries, having become completely demonic creatures due to their time in the hell universe they were trapped in. Whilst they naturally sought revenge against the Raseliacs above all else, the monsters were a danger to all life in the magical realm. And whilst they never built the empire that the Raseliacs did, they nevertheless became among the magician's deadliest enemies. This forced him, at one point, to form an alliance with the Raseliacs to beat them back. Thankfully, the magician also made many friends and companions over the course of his adventures as well. After his original companions either left, like Shobna, or died, he would pick up others from various worlds, as well as even some humans he would pick up on future journeys back to Xankia. By far and away, his most important companion, however, was his daughter Xankia. The magician did eventually find a way to travel back to our universe, and through time, as well as thanks to a time window. These anomalies were created from leftovers from the magic from our universe in the magical realm. Most of the time magic from our universe would be absorbed into the magical realm, if there was any crossover. But in a few cases, they could not only survive, but act as links to the original universe they came from. As magic is woven into the fabric of reality itself, then these anomalies can also contain links to certain time periods as well. Leftovers from the magician's own magics that were linked to his time eventually created a time window which would take him directly back to his own universe when his daughter Xankia, whom he named the planet after, was an adult. She had followed in his footsteps and become a very powerful witch in her own right. Her power had partially helped create the time window, as she inherited some of the same unique magic from her father. And so, when that power increased as a result of her unique skills, it created a link between the two universes across time. On her side, the time window existed on a small, unassuming planet named Castork that she had helped with her magics, which again served as the source of the window. Sadly, by this stage, Lindsay had passed on. She had lived a full life, and despite the loss of the man she loved, she was happy with her daughter, and proud of the great hero she became. The magician was devastated to discover that he had arrived too late. He couldn't go back and see Lindsay now, as he would be changing history as he and his daughter now knew it, and any changes to the timeline would create a paradox. Still, The loss of Lindsay did allow him to finally move on from her somewhat, and at the very least, he was able to get to know his daughter. He had a hard time convincing her that he was even her father at first, as he changed his appearance entirely since he last saw Lindsay. The magician changed his appearance many times for many reasons. Sometimes he had to, in order to survive, either to eject a powerful force that was overtaking him, or to go into hiding. Other times, it was just because he grew bored of a particular face again, for many reasons, cosmetically or out of shame for what he had done. Either way, he looked like a much younger man at this point than the one Zinkia had seen in pictures. Once she accepted it, Zinkia and the magician became extremely close, and they would regularly cross time and universes to visit each other, until she eventually became his companion. Sadly, however, she couldn't stay with her father for long, as she was still needed back in her own time. Nevertheless, she remained for many years, and when she did finally return, she saw that one of her worst enemies, the demonic entity known as the Vakrok, had grown in power and devastated many worlds. Her own people viewed her as a traitor, who had abandoned them, and whilst with the magician's help she was able to slay Vakrok, she ultimately decided to remain behind, and afterward things were awkward between her and her father. It wasn't that she was angry with him. She had after all made her own decision, but after her previous desertion, she did not want to get caught up in her father's life again. The two were never able to properly sort out their differences, though their last mission together, at least, was a positive experience where they saved the day. At some point, Axfor was able to discover the time window and took control of it, altering it to allow him to travel backwards in time to the point just before his people were destroyed by their enemies, the Kalkanta. Ironically, it was actually Axfor himself who destroyed his own people. The Kalkanta had intended to still bombard the Raseliacs after their surrender, but they did not actually wish to wipe them out. On the contrary, they intended the bombardment to simply serve as an example as to what would happen to their enemies and other races if they ever tried to resist. It was Axfor mixing his own dark magics from the future with those of the bombardment when it struck that finally caused the entire planet to ignite and be ripped apart. The Kalkanta leaders assumed that it was as a result of their own unstable magics, and would later write it into their own history books that they had deliberately wiped out the Raseliacs because they were a danger to the rest of the universe. The Raseliacs themselves, and ironically, Axfor's younger self, also believed that it was solely the Kalkanta too, with the future Axfor operating in secret. As soon as the magician learned that Axfor had captured the time window, he would track him down and travel through time itself, not knowing what Axfor had intended. When he arrived on the Raseliac's home planet, he actually encountered the younger Axfor, who, ironically in contrast to his later self, was a kind-hearted and noble war hero. The magician wanted to change things and stop the Raseliacs from ever coming to be, but again, through his dealings with Professor Fang, he knew that it was not possible to change history, and was ultimately forced to abandon the younger Axfor and his people. Ironically, it was when Axfor saw the magician use this face in the present that he remembered as belonging to the man who abandoned him, who he thought was his friend, that he was able to finally put the pieces together, with the help of other clues his future self had left him, to go back in time. After the bombardment, the future Axfor would give the spirit of his younger self the magic he needed to avoid being pulled into the fortress and to allow his people to be reborn, stronger than ever. Following this, the time window was destroyed by Axfor's abuse of it, preventing the magician from ever going back to see Zankia again. On the one hand, the magician's hatred of Axfor was increased to new levels for depriving him of a chance to ever see his daughter again, and for making him complicit in the rise of the Raseliacs. Yet he also felt a sense of responsibility for Axfor, having seen the good man he once was now, and would even try to help him after, though it didn't take long for the magician to see that his archenemy was truly beyond help. At the very least, he came to see Axfor as more than just a monster. Zankia, meanwhile, would continue to protect her people back in her time, eventually becoming one of the greatest and most celebrated heroes of her age, though again, That is a story for another time. She always hoped her father would return, but understood at least if he didn't, it would have been due to powers beyond his control. In spite of everything, she never regretted her time with him and was always proud of the good they had done together in the magical realm. The magician's other most important companion was his lover, named Tamia. She was a renegade from the people of the Green Mist who, unlike the others, genuinely cared about the race she had created, known as the Hansians. Their world was, in fact, the only that she had created, and due to her original status among the people of the Green Mist, she was able to ensure that it was protected from their sick games. Whilst Tamia may have shown compassion to the Hansians, she never lifted a finger to help the other worlds that the people of the Green Mist regularly tampered with, and in some cases, destroyed for their own amusement. She viewed the rest of her people as morally bankrupt, and therefore believed that anything they created was morally bankrupt and not worth their time. The actions of races like the Verseliacs, meanwhile, did little to convince her otherwise. Ultimately, however, her sneering sense of superiority proved to be her downfall, as it made her many enemies among the people who eventually not only overthrew her, but drained Tamia of her powers, and finally forced her to watch as her world was destroyed. Though one of her people, named Halka, survived, and would try and get his revenge on Tamia, who he believed had betrayed the Hansians, becoming a major enemy of both Tamia and the magician. Tamia originally joined the magician, who she knew from his past battles with the people of the Green Mist, in the hopes of getting her powers back and restoring her people. Initially, the magician only took her on as his companion due to her knowledge and found her condescending attitude insufferable. Over time, however, she gradually came to see the value of other worlds and came to deeply regret her past actions. Ironically, she became more devoted to helping the many life forms within their universe than any of the magician's other companions, and the two eventually fell in love. The magician, at first, felt guilty in moving on from Lindsay, despite the fact at this stage there was no chance of him ever meeting Lindsay again. Still, the two ultimately came to see their relationship as a chance to start over, to actually have a family, and from Tamia's point of view, create life that could have a happy ending. Tragically, this chance would be denied from them by Elysian, who had ironically, using a device that Tamia herself had created, found a way to infiltrate the Green Mist. Tamia had left it with a primitive civilization that the people of the Green Mist had deemed a failure and wished to destroy, but sadly Elysian was able to use it to infiltrate the Green Mist by fusing it with her dark magics, which soon spread throughout the mist like a poison. Elysian planned to use the Green Mist to create billions of dark worlds that she could use as an army to lay waste to the magical realm, and other realms too. Tamia ultimately sacrificed herself in order to sever Elysian's link with the Green Mist. The magician again was left broken, but he did not let himself sink into despair this time. Both he and Tamia, aware that there was always the possibility that their luck would run out, made a promise to one another that if anything happened to one of them, the other would not only continue their work throughout the universe of helping people, but they would still live their life. Both had already endured the worst loss before they even met, and knew how grief could twist and break a person's morality. Still, it was undoubtedly one of the most difficult periods of the magician's life, and once again he traveled alone for many years afterwards. He did later fall in love again with Ingrid Emerald, a time traveler from our reality, whose ship had the ability to travel across time and universes. Though sadly its journeys were random, and it could not take the magician to see Zenkia again. Much like the magician, Ingrid also changed her face, and not surprisingly, the two bonded over their somewhat unique appearances. Sadly, however, whilst the magician at one point did consider her offer of running away with Ingrid, he loved her so much, he could never abandon the magical universe, and she could never abandon her mission either, so they were forced to part company. Aside from his companions, the magician would also be assisted by the Zinkian Empire. After his journey back into our universe to defeat his archenemy, and the return journey that took several hundred years, humanity had grown considerably in power. Several more attacks from the magician's enemies to try and draw him out had finally convinced humanity that they couldn't just sit by, and they had to go out into this strange new universe and become a force to be reckoned with. The history of the subsequent Zinkian Empire was long and complex, and sadly, humanity would be guilty of carrying out atrocities against other races, like the Raseliacs had done. When he returned, the magician was horrified to see what his people had become, and wondered if they had even deserved saving, given the chaos they had always caused, whilst humanity, in turn, still hadn't forgiven him for the Raseliac invasion. In fact, propaganda even tried to downplay his role in helping humanity cross the Black Oceans, as ridiculous as that sounded. Still, in spite of this, he would still side with humanity against greater threats, such as the Raseliacs, and as time went on and the Zinkian Empire became more of a force of good, the magician was finally able to achieve some kind of reconciliation with his people. His final known companion was ironically one of the first, Shobna. She had also prolonged her life through magic, after helping to restore her people. She felt as though she had to watch over them. But after several centuries, and after being shunned by her own people, when she objected to the atrocities humanity carried out against other races, Shobna felt it was time to leave her world again, and rejoined her old friends. There is no denying that Richard Monstrous, or the magician's life, was one of incredible loss and hardship, but it is important not to let that overshadow the great things he did. His life was also one of discovery, adventure, and heroism. Whilst he may have made mistakes and been reckless at times, ultimately, it was through his own personal sacrifice that humanity was able to endure and flourish in the magical realm. It is a tragedy that it was only after he and Shobna seemingly vanished forever that humanity would finally properly acknowledge what it owed him, and stop condemning the magician entirely for his mistakes. But then, that has always been the nature of humanity, to never appreciate the value of something until it is gone.